Good morning, guys. Very thankful that you're here with us this morning. You know, standing up here after coming back from a week of camp, it's something that comes to mind that you may have no idea what has happened in somebody's life in a week's time. But when you fill it full of something like camp, I feel like I've been gone for a month. And I know I saw you last Sunday, so just be mindful of that whenever we look out and see our brothers and sisters doing a whole bunch of stuff. A lot can happen in a week, can't it? I mean, a lot can happen in a day. I mean, you could start out a day and be really having a good day, and then that day goes south real fast. But that's just another reason why we're encouraged to really reach out to each other. I mean, last year, early in the year, we did a whole study on the one another passages, right, of how much of the concept of God's people and the kingdom really on earth is about the interconnectivity, right? That woven nature of our lives and our desires, right? To be with each other and to develop friendships with each other so that when we have opportunity, we choose the Lord's family before we choose other things. There's no end. There's no shortage of things to choose to do in a day. Do we or are we mindful of ways that we can choose to do those things with or for our brothers and sisters in the family, right, in the church? So just some thoughts. And certainly we're going to talk about somebody that was pretty closely woven to another heart that very much loved the Lord this morning in our studying those that served well. Let's go ahead and bow before we get into our study this morning. Almighty God in heaven, we are so thankful for such a beautiful day and an opportunity to be here in this comfortable place with people we love to offer our worship to you. We're so thankful, Father, that your love is demonstrated in so many ways, and one is most certainly the preservation of your holy written word, that we might come to know you better, that we might come to learn of all the different things that different people that have loved you in this life have done in the past, that we might be inspired and moved and motivated in ways to try to emulate that behavior. We're so thankful, Father, for the Christians with whom we get to live shoulder to shoulder with now that encourage us all along the way. Help us to do things we cannot do ourselves. And we do pray, Father, that we always might keep our eye on things that we might be able to do one for another. Be with us, Father, while we study this morning. Bless our time together. Grant us and bless us with the understanding. Help us to gain knowledge, and help us to apply that knowledge, Father, to grow in wisdom all of our days. Be with us in this class, down the hall, and the world over, Father, as we endeavor to know more about you and your Son. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so biggest homework assignment you'll likely have for this quarter. But remember, we're studying a character study this quarter that falls in line with our theme this year, right? Developing a life of service. And not so much just developing, because many of us have already lived a life that is easy to see ways that we serve the Lord in a variety of capacities. And yet for those, I would say, let's just find a few new ways to serve in new capacities. And so one of the things we thought would complement that theme and that idea well was a character study over a quarter of a variety of different people that showed characteristics that we may not have picked up on before. Stories that might seem so familiar to us, but yet sometimes we might miss what I like to call the pearls between the pages. We look and we read and we understand some stories and historical accounts, and we're moved by them and we're motivated by them, certainly educated and uplifted by them or warned by them. But sometimes if we scratch a little more, there's more to be seen. There's a movie I always like that's a picture that is given as a gift, and there's this tiny little hole in the corner. And yet after close inspection, they realize that the front painting is just a mask for one of the most rarest paintings that the world has ever seen. And then, of course, that's revealed. I feel like that's what Bible study's like sometimes. We get to that point where we didn't realize the depth of what God has for us in a text. And that's always our caution, right? It doesn't matter how many times we've read through something. pray for the understanding, and read the will of the Lord until our last day. So, which character did we choose to study this week? Anybody remember? Jonathan. So Jonathan's story, and I mean, he's told his story is captured captures a large part, or is encapsulated in a large part in 1st and 2nd Samuel there. And what would we say that we might come to know just about 1st and 2nd Samuel? Like as an Old Testament set of books, what just at the 10,000 foot view, like if you're going to try to start into a study, you're going to pull some people into some conversation here about the scriptures here, what are just some first kind of, maybe we might say, housekeeping issues that we might say about this, as far as maybe in the time period that this happens, who's really talked about? What would we say? I know this is off the cuff, but this is kind of stuff I'm hoping that we kind of already know. Dawn?
In a way, how he went from being such a promise to really such a failure.
Okay, so Dawn puts a dot in the map, I would say kind of about in the middle, which is a very, very valid point. So even at the very beginning, like, when you study the Bible sometimes with people that haven't studied the Bible yet, it's helpful to say, hey, you know why we study the book of Galatians? You know why it's called that? It's because there's a place on the map called Galatia. And there are people there. There are people in the Lord's church there, and so since they're from Galatia, they're Galatians. So this is a letter that Paul wrote to the church at Galatia, and so it's Galatians. Like, we live in America, so we're Americans. And so the names of the books in the Bible mean different things. So what's even represented here just out of the gate by titles? Who's involved? And so Samuel is a huge character, right, in the Old Testament. So what was Samuel? Samuel was the last great prophet of Israel, right? So we might say that this was then the end of the prophets, right? This is a period of time that's a major shift, right, in the Old Testament as far as how God deals with his people. Well, governs, or maybe, yeah, so you figure out how you want to explain that, because we're moving away from then the prophets to then what? The kings. And then so then we might say then the first king of Israel was Saul, and he had a lot of promise, but it doesn't take us long to find out about his fall. And so let's just kind of maybe get into the questions. I might answer a few as we go. And really, we're not going to go in and harvest massive amounts of text, because I think that might pull away from some of the points I hope to have time for this morning. But when we're talking about Jonathan, how is Jonathan related to 1st and 2nd Samuel? Who is this guy? Kind of, I guess the second question first. Who was his father? Saul. So Saul was what? King. First king of Israel, right? So Jonathan is this character that we want to look at for a variety of reasons this morning. And the first question was Jonathan accomplished in battle? Okay, how would we say yes? What did you read? What did you pull out of the text that would say that he was accomplished in battle? Because 1 Samuel kind of 13, 14, 15-ish, right? Talks about him defeating the Ammonites and defeating the Philistines. And I'll just throw just a tiny little tidbit out there, because I love the way Bible history and secular history overlap. So he deploys this tactic, right, of this funneling technique at Michmash that they recreate in World War I at exactly the same place. And it was a successful capture. So like when you think about, right, how sometimes Bible wisdom overlays itself into real world things, we don't hear about stuff like that very often, but naturally we hope to apply all the New Testament wisdom to our life and expect the same results. But sometimes even something as interesting as deploying a maneuver and utilizing the geography, and then honestly history puts you in the exact same place again. And so maybe it pays to know the history of the Scriptures, right? So we talk so much about knowing the Old Testament helps us have a better understanding of God. And so we certainly don't want to discount it, even though we may not study it very much. So yes, very much accomplished in battle. Was he a faithful son to Saul? Yeah, so we have quite a few stories in the Old Testament where sons were quite disappointing. Who are some sons that we know just didn't measure up? Who would? Okay, so some of David's sons, right? So there was a lot of fighting. But remember, because why did all that come about for David?
Because of what he had done.
Because of his sin with Bathsheba, because God said the sword will never depart from your house. And I mean, what a terrible thing. Now, anybody else? I'm thinking of one character pair that we'll just kind of move through. If nobody gets it, it's okay. Woo! Man, who was it? I think Zippy's the one that says it all the time. What do you say about, if I don't do anything right, at least I could be used as a bad example or something like that. So Eli's sons.
Bad example.
That's it. That's it. So Eli's sons were exactly that. Eli was a what? Eli was a priest, but his sons were so evil that they were having fornication with people at the temple. It said they were so dishonest that they made the people despise the offering to the Lord. But Jonathan was not that, and faithful in so many ways. But let's think about something for a moment. Was he in line to be king? So, by the way that kings and dynasties and kingdoms and all this kind of stuff happen, even though we know that God establishes Saul as the what king? First king. Then who normally then by succession would be the king after Saul? Right? And so we might say this may be precedenting a little bit because this would have been kind of that first transfer of power. But yet, one of the things that I think is quite powerful as an example is, I guess the point of this story is who took his place then? Okay, so David took his place. Now, when we think about our attitude, and I'll say this for the sake of time, I think one of the most powerful examples that we have to display this kind of attitude in the New Testament was John the Baptist. And does anybody know where I'm getting at with John the Baptist when we talk about Jonathan and his opportunity, but yet David is that? And do you remember what he said? It's time for me to
Decrease.
Man, I hope that we never forget the example that's set by that. Because you realize the following that John the Baptist had? What did the Bible say about how great John the Baptist was? I tell you that as far as men born among women, which is everybody, there is none greater than John the Baptist. But I tell you that he that is the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. So John was an amazingly powerful force for God. But he tells his people, it's time for me to decrease. And it's time for the Lord to increase. And so look at how different that attitude and that transaction could have been. Go back here to Jonathan. Look at how powerful Jonathan was. Jonathan was very accomplished in battle. I would say some of the most successful warriors that we read of, Jonathan's in that list. And so what do we have a tendency to do then when we're really good at displaying our power? We have a mastery of conquering. What is our temptation then? What's a tendency that we might try to do in other areas of our life?
Keep advancing.
Right? Just steamroll, right? I'm going to take command of whatever I see because I'm a victor in battle. But boy, what an amazing story that we read and how things transpire between Saul and David and Jonathan. Because did Saul say, hey, Jonathan, there's this really good guy I'd like you to meet. I want you to be best pals. And I'm paraphrasing a lot because there's a lot of history here. And now granted, there were times where things were well with Saul and David. Because again, Saul requested the presence of David to do what? Right? Because why? Because Saul was vexed, it says in the King James, right? And sometimes he would call David to play the harp for him because he was very skilled. Anybody remember sometimes how Saul would repay the favor of David playing the harp for him? I mean, just sitting there one morning, and then look up, and the king, it's ready to throw a spear at you. And did David run away and never serve Saul again? No. And boy, I'm trying to avoid all the really big characters, but boy, what a service study that would be, right? Because even when it was in the hand of David to take Saul's life, remember when Saul goes in to cover his feet in the cave, and all of his mighty men of battle, all of his mighty men of renown said, today God has delivered him into your hand. David fought with these men. David had a history with these men. David did so many things to conquer for good for God with these men. And David, in that moment, with all of his valiant men, says, this is it. And then is that when David strikes? No. Anybody remember what David does? Because when you think about what Saul really in there for, and then you realize how close he really was, because he waited for them to get a distance, right? And then holds up the garment. He's like, let this be witness today that though God delivered you into my hand, I would not raise my hand against what? The Lord's anointed, right? And so just a magnificent piece there. But yet, so we definitely see, though, as the power transfers to David, the relationship that Jonathan then begins to develop with David. And David and Jonathan have, I would say, and we're going to talk about this in one of our questions, probably one of the most unique relationships, right, that we will ever read about in the Old Testament. So, because of his ability to open his mind and his heart and not just assume, because he's such a great warrior, that he's going to fight and get his way in everything, which again is a lesson to us, right? How much did this affect his service to God? If John or Rick or Brian or Ed thinks they're going to be doing something great in the kingdom. John, I'm going to pick on you for a minute. We might assume that we're going to serve in a certain way in a certain season of our life. And God may have very different plans for you. Maybe you're going to wait till retirement and then you're going to go crazy, spending time traveling, visiting people, checking on the sick, checking on the shut-ins, doing all this kind of ministry, and then you find out you get some kind of condition where you can't drive or walk or really do much of anything. Because sometimes, especially in the lesson here with Jonathan, you may start to dare to dream of opportunities that you might have in the kingdom. But then life starts to change for you. And you don't get the things that you thought were coming to you. And so then you begin to feel like you're being punished. Or that God is not happy with you. Or that these are somehow trials of negativity, and these things are loss. We look at them as loss so very often, right? Because that's exactly what the devil wants us to look at them. But we have to take a step back and recognize that may have, your thinking of how you were going to serve in your mature years may have never been how God planned for you to serve. It's how you planned for you to serve. And sometimes when we find characters like Jonathan, and we realize, and point me out, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't ever find a single reference in the text that Jonathan is ever sour about the fact that David is next in line to be king. And yet when I think about, I know a lot of people, and I know John and I talk a lot because of just the physical condition he has, and he prays so much, and he's got a good attitude about it, but he's like, this is not what I thought I was going to be doing. I have a very different heart. I want to be doing very different things. I want to be doing so many more things. And how hard it is sometimes in that weakness of the flesh, right? Because remember what God told Paul. My grace is sufficient. And that's truth enough in itself. But my strength will be made complete in your weakness. And so it's in our lack, however frustrating or depressing or discouraging it may be, it's in our lack. And sometimes when that lack comes because of the number of years we've lived, our lack is what discourages us. But it's in the lack that then God is then more visible in our lives. And so in Jonathan's lack of this opportunity to guide the nation of Israel, he does not let that affect his service to God. In fact, he becomes such a close friend to David, they're able to work together and to work so much good for the kingdom. And that's really one of the bigger points of the lesson this morning. Why do we want to think about Jonathan and how he served? Because we can maybe relate. We may not be in line to be king, but maybe there's other things in our lives that we really expected or that we really had our heart set on doing. And because now that we can't, we let that darken our heart. We let that just kind of cross our arms and sit back and say, well, I'll try again later. When who's to say that's not the very moment in your fleshly weakness that God is hoping you'll shine? Because we have to appreciate the fact that there is a myriad of ways we can serve each other. And I hope and pray that my body lasts. But if it doesn't, I hope my voice does. Because sometimes a phone call is worth more to somebody in a day than everything else they had planned. And thankfully, communication is pretty easy. And so I couldn't think of a better character to bring out in a way, to talk about this major shift, but yet not letting it affect his attitude for the Lord. How close then did Jonathan become to David? Right? Like a brother. And I thought I wrote the verse down, but I don't think I kept it or I didn't save it. I've been having some internet connectivity back there. It doesn't always save everything. I think it's a verse in Proverbs, and help me out if you can remember it. A brother is born for adversity, but a friend loveth at all times. And we might say, well, I got some friends that don't love me at all times. Well, the idea is that if you're really a true friend, you will love at all times is the encouragement there. And so, when we think about how the relationship with David and Jonathan developed, it is certainly like brothers, but it's said in a certain way in the Scriptures that allows the world to try to skew and abuse this relationship. Does anybody remember the reference that I'm thinking of?
18:3.
Read that for me.
Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself.
Oh, okay. Isn't it right after that? It has something about woman.
About what?
About woman.
Oh.
Because it didn't save for me. I don't have it. I'm not going to Google it real quick. That's going to be real awkward watching you guys. You watch me look something.
And sang as they played in song.
Okay. No. So, and forgive me for not having the verse. There's a verse in his story that talks about Jonathan's relationship to David was stronger than that of a woman, than the love of a woman. What do we make of that? I was going to say, because what's the world go to? The Bible glorifies homosexuality. And you Bible beaters are foolish if you can't see it in plain black and white in the story of Jonathan and David. Man, I'm telling you, the first time I heard that argument about tear the cover off my Bible, I'm like, what? And I'm like, where in the world are they getting that? And then that's the verse that they point to. So then let's talk about this for a minute. How then does that not promote homosexuality? Somebody look that verse up for me so we can get the exact words. You got it, Casey? Read it for me.
126.
What version are you from, or version? ESV.
He says, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant you have been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women.
And the verse reference was again?
2 Samuel 1:26.
2 Samuel 1:26. Okay, how does that not promoting homosexuality? Come on, we need to know this. What's that? Not that kind of love. So elaborate on that a little bit, John. What do you mean by not that kind of love? Okay, now you're getting it. So we've talked about this, right? Because you guys know my vent on sex, right? If we talked about sex more, we understood what sex was, and we celebrated sex for what it was to be and not hide and cower from it and respond to it like the devil wants us to, then sex would be celebrated. It's one of the greatest gifts we're given in the union of husband and wife. Well, I get kind of uncomfortable when we talk about it because, yeah, right. And I mean, I try to make sure that they know that because I want our teens asking us about sex. I want them to know that mom and dad is the safe place. Mom and dad is the source of authority. Well, mom and dad are going to the source of authority, which is the Word of God, to talk to us about how we behave appropriately physically. But how much, if you had to take a percentage from 1 to 100, how much of a percentage of the sum total of your relationship with your spouse is sex? It's relatively small. And I'm not talking about frequency and all that other kind of stuff. I'm just talking about the sum total of your relationship, right? Sex is a small part of it. But when you read this, and that's immediately what you jump to, oh, well, this right here, this is a physical relationship between two men. Guys, think about the depth of the connection you have with your spouse. If you have a good godly spouse, you know this. Because if you don't, you don't. I'm sorry. You might have a good worldly connection, but you don't have a deep spiritual connection. And you think about what that connection means. You think about the benefit and the strength and the comfort and the peace and the wisdom and the provision that comes from that relationship. There's so much more than just that. So don't ever cheapen the relationship between Jonathan and David and think it's some kind of play on homosexuality. It is a friendship that somehow, by the grace of God, provided for them in the deepest ways possible, but not sexually. Dawn?
You know, I've thought about this a lot, that I think that the world has such deviant things about what love is, that it's connected it so much to sexual relations, that there's a whole generation that is floundering because they don't understand how you can love a person as a friend without a sexual connection. They don't understand that true bond of being just a loving friend that supports you. And so it all goes into the sexual relationship, so I must be gay, or I must be this, or I don't know what I am at all, I'll play the field. And it's scary because I think, again, we lose that friendship.
And culturally, Meredith,
in English, we read in our translation of the Bible the word love, 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 all through the Old Testament and New Testament. But in the original language, there are 5 different words. So if people were reading this in the original language, the sentence, "Your love to me was extraordinary," would be one word. "Surpassing the love of women," that would be another word. And
there's a place
you wouldn't be jumping all over that word love because there were very specific words that meant very different things.
Well, that's a very point. And there's a place even in the scriptures, and it fails me right now, where faith, right? The faith, your faith, a faith, right? In one verse, 3 different faiths are used, and it's not the same thing, right? However, so just one quick point about maybe how some of this is happening, and then this last question. So sex, unfortunately, in our culture now is becoming so detached, it's becoming its own thing. And so sex and sexual activity and your sexual prominence or prowess or whatever it is becomes kind of its own component of your life. It's part of your personality. It's part of what you do, how you do it, when you, like whatever that is, it becomes this separate thing. And it was never meant to be a separate thing. It was always meant to be the blessing, the cherry on top of the sundae. It was meant to be this gift that comes after this commitment that is made. But just like the devil does with everything else that God has given us, he yanks it, twists it, molests it, takes it out of order, and tries to concentrate on some things, and that's not the way that God has had that put together. Tim, do you have your hand up, or are you just checking? Okay.
Well, that's my subtle way.
That's okay, appreciate it.
I would say the burden of proof falls on Satan, who is he is the accuser who spouts out these accusations with what proof? And so I would say you prove that there's any kind of homosexuality in this verse, I don't have to prove anything. Because first of all, there's no evidence of it.
No.
This is a lament for a dead man.
Yeah.
You don't lament
Well,
for
yeah,
a
because
dead
this is
man.
right after he dies.
Yeah,
And
you
it's
don't
all
lament
right.
for a dead man saying, oh, he was a great lover. You lament for the man saying, even if you were gay, you would probably say he was a good friend, he was a good companion. It's very crass and very crude to reduce the man's life in a eulogy that speaks of him in sexual terms.
Man, I couldn't have said that better. Think about the context of what we're talking about. We didn't have time to get into a lot of it, but Saul and Jonathan die. And David is the lamenting. And boy, I like the way you put that. How cheap and how crass do you have to be to think that we're going to strip down the eulogy of a guy that was so connected to another person that he might be like the extension of his heart, we might say. And to try to wrestle it and try to make it to be some filthy, disgusting thing that the devil has put together. So as we close out, we've got a minute left. I guess I kind of want, anybody have any lasting comments though before they say? I want you to think about Jonathan. I want you to think about how fierce he was for God. I want you to think about the relationship that he had. And I want you to think about how can I let this influence me? What am I going to take away from this morning to really try to pivot on for this next week? And think about, right? Jonathan, very willing to go to war for the Lord. You know, we get kind of timid sometimes as Christians because we want to back away from fighting for the sake of our peacekeeping. And we should, because it's not that kind of fight. But at the same time, you have to be ready for battle because it's the fight every day. That's one of the ways we can be like Jonathan. We can certainly reserve our strongest relationship for the Lord because it was because David loved the Lord with all that he had. And Jonathan was able to see the love that David had. And for the faithfulness that we had in Jonathan, I'm going to assume a little bit that he had a fierce love for God as well. And when two people love God that much, God opens up new opportunities for things, new opportunities for people. And so reserve our strongest relationship for the Lord and then see what he opens up in other people and be this kind of friend. Thank you guys very much for your time and your thoughts. I do not have our next character picked out yet, so keep track of your email. And those of you that don't have email, I'll try to get it out to you directly here tomorrow.